Give me your hand and forget the past. It was a sentiment for poets and fools, not for a woman whose reality was splintered wood and creeping damp. Eleanor traced the water stain blooming across the ceiling of her father's study, a faded map of their slow decline. The air, thick with the scent of mildewed paper and quiet desperation, was her inheritance. Her hands, chapped from lye soap and mending, were the only tools she had left to fight the decay. They were not the soft, pale hands of a lady of leisure. They were the hands of a survivor, and they were, it seemed, her only remaining currency. The letter on the desk before her was proof of that. Proposal, not of love, but of salvation, from a man she had never met, a spectre known only by his title, the Duke of Blackwood. A reclusive, scarred monster, if the whispers from the village were to be believed. He would save her family's crumbling estate, settle their debts, and secure her father's care. In return, he required her hand in marriage. The crunch of gravel outside announced the arrival of his emissary. Not the Duke himself, such a creature would never deign to visit their ruin, but his man of affairs, a Mr. Thorne. When he was shown in, he was not what she expected. He was tall and severe, dressed in dark, well-made clothes that were starkly practical. There was no powdered wig, no ostentatious jewelry, only a grim set to his jaw and eyes the color of a winter storm. He moved with a coiled stillness that seemed ill-suited to a mere steward, his presence filling the small, shabby room with an unnerving authority. "Miss Ainsworth," he began, his voice a low baritone that resonated with a power he seemed to be actively suppressing. "I am here on behalf of His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, to finalize the terms of the marriage contract." He laid the document on the desk, its thick vellum a stark white against the scarred mahogany. Felt less like a proposal and more like a surrender. Eleanor stood straighter, summoning a dignity that felt as threadbare as the rug beneath her feet. "The terms are acceptable," the words tasted like ash. Her freedom for their survival. It was a bargain she had to make. He watched her, his gaze analytical, almost cold. She felt like an insect under glass, a specimen being evaluated for its fortitude. There was no pity in his eyes, but something else she couldn't name. An unnerving focus. "His Grace has instructed me to remain," Mr. Thorne stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am to oversee the initial restorations to the estate, to ensure his investment is sound." So she was an investment. The thought should have stung, but she was too numb for fresh pain. "As you wish, Mr. Thorne. You will find us accommodating." She would be gracious. She would be poised. She would be the perfect, pliant duchess-in-waiting, even for this cold-eyed steward. It was the first act of her new life, a performance for an audience of one. In the days that followed, Mr. Thorne was a constant, disquieting presence. He was everywhere, his long strides carrying him across the fallow fields, his sharp eyes assessing the rotten timbers of the barn. He spoke little, but his silence was heavy with observation. Eleanor found herself watching him in turn. There was a stark contradiction about him. He discussed crop rotation with the tenant farmers with an expert's knowledge, yet his hands, though ungloved, were not the calloused hands of a man who worked the land. When he gestured to a map of the property, she saw the faint, silvery trace of a scar disappearing beneath his cuff. She attempted to be the lady of the manor, offering him tea in the faded drawing room, but he seemed to prefer the raw honesty of the outdoors. It was there, while reviewing his plans for the east pasture, that she found her voice. "You mean to plow it under for barley," she stated, looking at his neat diagrams. "It is the most profitable use of the land," he replied, his gaze fixed on the paper. "It is, if you wish for a single season of profit before the soil is depleted. The lower half floods every spring. My grandfather planted it with watercress and willow for weaving. It provided a smaller, but more consistent, income for the village." He stopped, looking at her for the first time not as a future duchess or a problem to be managed, but as a person with knowledge. His stormy eyes held hers, a flicker of surprise in their depths. "The Duke's surveyors did not mention that." "The Duke's surveyors have not lived here their entire lives," she said quietly, a sliver of her true self breaking through the placid facade. "They see acres and shillings. I see a home." He was silent for a long moment, the wind tugging at a loose strand of her hair. "I will amend the plans," he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time she had been heard, truly heard, in a very long time. The truce between them was fragile, an unspoken acknowledgement of mutual competence. It was shattered by the autumn gale that tore through the valley one night, a furious, shrieking thing that rattled the very bones of the old house. Eleanor was woken by a deafening crack, followed by the sound of shattering glass. She grabbed a lantern and ran towards the library, her heart pounding. The storm had breached the house. A massive oak branch had smashed through the ceiling-high windows, and rain was pouring in, soaking the priceless books her father cherished more than anything. She was frantically trying to move a heavy bookshelf when a shadow fell over her. It was Thorn, his shirt soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't speak, simply put his shoulder next to hers and pushed. Together, they moved the heavy piece of furniture away from the deluge. For hours they worked in a frantic, silent rhythm, moving books, covering shelves with oilcloths, and boarding the broken window against the driving rain. The lantern cast dancing shadows, illuminating the raw effort on his face. In the chaos, the carefully constructed walls between them crumbled. He was no longer the Duke's formidable agent, and she was not the bartered bride. They were two people fighting to save something beautiful from destruction. As he reached for a high shelf, his sleeve pulled back, revealing the full extent of the scar she had only glimpsed before. It was a vicious, puckered thing, a remnant of some terrible violence that snaked up his forearm. He saw her looking and instinctively pulled the cuff down, his jaw tightening. The moment of shared purpose fractured, replaced by his familiar, guarded mask. "The worst is over," he said, his voice strained. "You should rest." But Eleanor couldn't look away from the memory of that wound. It spoke of a pain he kept hidden beneath his severe exterior, a vulnerability that resonated with her own. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than he could possibly know. He merely nodded, his back already turned as he began assessing the damage, the distance between them once more a vast, unbridgeable chasm. A strange, quiet intimacy began to grow in the storm's aftermath. They fell into a pattern, often taking their simple suppers together in the kitchen, the only room that was dependably warm. The grand dining hall remained cold and silent, a relic of a life that no longer existed. It was during these quiet evenings that he began to speak of the Duke, always in the third person, always with a detached, melancholy air. "His Grace finds little joy in company," he said one evening, staring into the flickering flames of the hearth. "The war, it left its mark on his body and his soul." Eleanor thought of the scar on his arm. "No man should be judged by his scars, Mr. Thorn. They are merely a map of where he has been." His gaze snapped to hers, intense and searching. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, making him look both older and more vulnerable. A noble sentiment, but the world is not so kind. The tongue whispers. They call him a monster, a recluse. They imagine some disfigured beast rattling around his castle. He was testing her. She knew, probing her for shallowness, for the revulsion he expected. She met his gaze without flinching, her own heart aching with a surprising pang of sympathy for the unknown Duke. "Then the world is filled with fools," she said, her voice soft but firm. "A man's worth is not in the smoothness of his skin, but in the integrity of his heart. Does this Duke possess such a thing?" The question hung in the air between them. Thorn's throat worked, and for a moment, she thought he might finally offer a piece of his true self. The lie was a physical weight in his chest. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, had come to inspect his prospective bride, to ensure she was not a vapid fortune hunter. He had expected to find a simpering miss easily cowed. Instead, he found Eleanor. He found a woman with the resilience of an oak and the quiet grace of a wildflower growing in the cracks of a ruin. He found a woman whose simple, honest words were beginning to heal wounds he thought were permanent. She was speaking of him, the true him, and her compassion was a balm he had not realized he so desperately needed. "I believe," he said slowly, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide, "that he is trying to find it again." Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of Sir Reginald Crouch, a neighboring landowner whose family had long held a grudge against hers. He arrived unannounced, his portly figure filling the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the hall with a proprietary sneer. He had heard the rumors of Eleanor's arrangement and had come to gloat. Well, Ainsworth's girl, selling herself to the monster of Blackwood," he boomed, his voice echoing in the hall. "I'm sure the beast will be grateful for a warm body in his cold bed. Pity about the face, they say. Can you bear to look at him?" Eleanor froze, mortification and fury warring within her. Before she could utter a scathing reply, Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the study. He moved with a lethal grace that was utterly at odds with his supposed station. "Sir Reginald," Thorne said, his voice deceptively mild, "you are trespassing." Crouch laughed, a nasty, brutish sound. "And who are you to tell me so?" "The beast's kennel master." He took a step toward Eleanor, his intentions clear. "Perhaps the lady would prefer a man with a whole face to—" He never finished the sentence. Thorne closed the distance between them in 2 silent strides. He did not touch him. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood before the larger man, his presence radiating an aura of absolute, chilling authority. "The Duke's lands extend to this road. His patience, however, does not. You will leave this house now, and you will not return. If you ever speak to Miss Ainsworth again, you will find that the Duke's influence reaches much farther than you can possibly imagine." The words were a quiet threat, delivered with the certainty of a man who had never known his orders to be questioned. Sir Reginald paled, his blustering arrogance deflating like a pricked balloon. He saw something in Thorne's eyes, something that terrified him. He stammered an apology and practically fled from the house. Eleanor stared at Thorne, her heart hammering against her ribs. That was not the voice of a steward. That was the voice of a master, a nobleman, a man born to command. He had defended her, not just her person, but her honor and the honor of her future husband. In that moment the lines blurred. Mr. Thorne, the stern steward, and the Duke, the monstrous recluse, began to merge into a single, complex, and captivating man. A man who was standing right in front of her. The air in the hall was thick with unspoken things. The echo of Sir Reginald's cruelty and the startling force of Mr. Thorne's defense left Eleanor trembling. He turned to her, the hard mask of command softening as his eyes met hers. The concern in his gaze was so genuine, so raw, it stole her breath. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice now gentle. She could only nod, her mind racing. That evening, she sought him out in the small, walled garden she had begun to reclaim from weeds and neglect. The moon was high, casting the world in silver and shadow. He was standing by the crumbling stone wall, looking out over the sleeping valley. "He will not bother you again," he said, without turning. "It was not your place to intervene," she whispered, though she was profoundly grateful he had. "You are His Grace's steward." He finally turned to face her, his expression etched with a deep, internal conflict. Sometimes a man must act on what is right, not what is his place. The lie was a poison in his veins. He had wanted to strike Crouch, to defend her name with the fury he felt, but he held back, clinging to the last threads of his deception. "Eleanor," he murmured, the name a soft caress. It was the first time he had used it. "The Duke, he does not deserve you." The confession was a blade to his own heart. He, Alistair, did not deserve her. She stepped closer, her worn slippers silent on the grass. The moonlight caught the earnest planes of her face, her eyes wide and searching. "And what do you think I deserve, Mr. Thorne?" The question was a quiet challenge, an invitation. He saw in her eyes not just gratitude, but a dawning affection that mirrored the storm in his own soul. He could not bear the lie a moment longer, yet he could not bring himself to speak the truth and risk shattering this fragile connection. So he did the only thing he could. He closed the small distance between them, his hand rising as if of its own accord to cup her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, a touch of reverent wonder. "Someone who sees you," he breathed, his voice ragged, "truly sees you," and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of weeks of suppressed yearning, of admiration and regret. It was the taste of truth in a world of lies. Eleanor responded with a fervor that surprised them both, her hands coming up to grip his arms, anchoring herself to him. This was real. This connection, this powerful, undeniable pull between them, was the most real thing she had ever felt. They broke apart, breathless, the world spinning around them. And into that sacred silence came the sound of galloping hooves. A rider, bearing a torch that cut a fiery swath through the darkness, reined his horse in at the edge of the garden. He leapt from the saddle, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He carried a dispatch case, the ducal crest of Blackwood gleaming in the torchlight. The rider saw them standing so close and immediately swept into a low, deferential bow. "Your Grace," the man panted, holding out the case. "An urgent message from London. The Prime Minister's office." The world stopped. Time itself seemed to freeze, the rider's words echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. "Your Grace." Eleanor's gaze flew from the bowing man to the face of the man she had just kissed, the man she knew as Mr. Thorne. His eyes were closed, his expression one of pure, unadulterated agony. The truth, brutal and devastating, crashed down upon her. "Your Grace." The words were a shard of ice in her throat. He opened his eyes. They were the eyes of a stranger, filled with a regret so profound it was bottomless. He was the Duke. He was the scarred monster. He was the man who had bought her, and he had been playing a part, testing her, deceiving her from the very first moment. Every shared confidence, every quiet look, every moment of burgeoning trust. It was all a lie, a cruel, calculated charade. "Eleanor, he began, but the betrayal was a physical force, shoving her back, away from him. "You are the Duke?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The man she had defended, the man for whom she had felt such compassion, was the architect of her humiliation. He could only nod, the simple movement a confession that destroyed everything. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and hollow. "A test," she said, the words flat, dead. This was all a test? Was I a horse to be inspected before purchase? A piece of property to be appraised? The hurt in her eyes was a physical blow, more painful than any wound he had ever received on the battlefield. He saw the beautiful, fragile thing that had grown between them turn to dust and ashes before his very eyes. "No," he choked out. "It started that way, but it became a lie," she finished for him, her voice gaining a sharp, brittle strength. "It became a lie you were content to continue. You let me speak of the Duke, of you, with pity. You let me bare my soul to you, all while you were judging me." She backed away, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her splintering self together. When she reached the house, she turned back, her face a pale mask of resolve in the moonlight. "The arrangement is void. I will not be the prize in your cruel game. Leave this house. Leave, Your Grace." The title was an insult, a bitter reminder of the gulf he himself had carved between them. He tried to speak, to explain how his cynical test had backfired, how he had fallen in love with the woman he was meant to merely approve. But the shuttered look on her face told him it was useless. He had broken her trust, and in doing so had broken himself. He retreated to his carriage, defeated. The great, cold castle of Blackwood awaited him, no longer just a refuge from the world, but a prison of his own making. The silence within its walls was a constant, screaming accusation. He had sought a suitable duchess, but he had lost Eleanor. and the loss was an emptiness far greater than any scar. Weeks bled into a month of desolate silence. At her home, Eleanor fought to keep her family afloat, the specter of ruin a constant companion. She was proud and resolute, but her heart was a hollow ache in her chest. She missed the stern steward, the man she thought she knew, with a pain that was sharp and relentless. At Blackwood, Alastair was tormented. The grand rooms echoed with the memory of her voice, her quiet strength. He saw her everywhere, in the hardy winter roses in his garden, in the honest grain of a wooden table, in the flickering warmth of the fire. He had commanded armies, advised ministers, and ruled his vast estates with an iron will, but he was powerless against the memory of one woman's betrayed eyes. His deception had been born of a cynical desire to protect himself from a heartless world. He saw now that, in doing so, he had become the very thing he despised. He had been the heartless one. He had to earn her forgiveness, even if he could never earn back her love. He returned to her home not in a grand ducal carriage, but on a single horse, dressed in the simple, dark clothes of Mr. Thorne. He did not go to the front door to command an audience. He found her where he knew she would be, in her small, struggling garden, her hands buried in the dirt. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded, weary. He stopped a few feet away, holding a legal document in his hand. It was not a marriage contract. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raw, "I have come to make amends. Not with words, which I have proven I cannot be trusted with, but with action." He held out the paper. "This is the deed to this estate. It is yours, free and clear. I have also established a trust to provide for its upkeep and your father's care. It is all in your name. There are no conditions." He placed the document on the stone bench between them. "Your freedom. It is the only thing I can offer. I ask for nothing in return." He looked at her, his soul bared in his eyes. The arrogance of the Duke was gone, stripped away, leaving only a man vulnerable and broken, prepared to walk away forever if it meant she could be whole again. Eleanor stared at the deed, then back at his face. She saw no deceit there, only a deep, aching sincerity. He had given up all his power over her. He had offered her respect, the one thing she had never believed she would get from him. Her heart, which had been frozen for weeks, began to thaw. "You ask for nothing," she said, her voice trembling. She rose and walked toward him. "But what if I wish to offer something?" Alastair looked up, his expression a mask of hope warring with despair. He hardly dared to breathe. She stopped before him and slowly, deliberately held out her hand, her bare, work-worn hand. "You once commanded me to forget the past. I find I cannot. The past is what has made us. But perhaps we could build a future upon its ruins." Tears welled in his eyes as he took her hand, his grasp not that of a duke claiming his due, but of a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. "Eleanor," he breathed, the name a prayer. Months later, they stood together at a tall window in Blackwood Castle. The room was no longer cold and imposing. A fire blazed in the hearth, and a simple vase on the mantel held a cluster of wildflowers from her garden at home. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the quiet comfort of shared presence. Alastair no longer hid his scars. He had discarded the high-collared jackets, the carefully arranged hair. He was simply himself. Eleanor reached up and gently traced the faint scar that curved beside his temple. He closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into her hand. "Give me your hand and forget the past," he had once thought to command. Now, holding her hand in his, he knew the truth. It was not about forgetting. It was about forgiving. It was about taking the broken pieces of the past and, together, building a future worthy of the love they had almost lost.